Welcome to Future Histories. My name is Jan Groß, and it is my great pleasure to welcome Rodrigo Nunes in today's episode. He is a senior lecturer in political theory and organization at the University of Essex and author of the book Neither Vertical Nor Horizontal, A Theory of Political Organization, and the forthcoming Anatomy of Disintegration, What Brazil Reveals About the Far Right, forthcoming later this year. Before we start, I would like to thank Fabian, Wilfried, Christoph, and Lukas for their kind donations. And now, please enjoy today's episode with Rodrigo Nunes on ecologies of organization and democratic transformation. Welcome, Rodrigo.
Thank you, Jan.
It's my pleasure. Rodrigo, one of the main takeaways of your book is that when it comes to questions of organization, we should think and act ecologically. And ecologically in this case means ecologies of organization and not just ecology in the sense of quote-unquote nature. So could you maybe explain what it means to think and act ecologically?
So there is a traditional grammar that people normally use to think about questions of organization. The grammar in which the question of organization, quote unquote, tended to be couched from, say, the 19th century onwards. And this is, as I started thinking about questions of political organization, it struck me that this entire grammar, which, tends to be generally just accepted without any questioning, was highly problematic. The traditional grammar that I'm referring to is the one that assumes that organization is something that pertains to organizations. So there is organization from the moment when people get together and start an organization, and therefore what exists previously would be presumably unorganized. Therefore, that the question of organization is a question that is essentially asked of individual groups or individual organizations. So essentially the question of organization is the question of the organizational form that different organizations take. And finally, there is the assumption that the question of organization is ultimately the question of what the ideal organizational form is. So what is the ideal organizational form that every organization should have? Or ultimately, because, this, if you assume there is an ideal form, everything points to, what is the ultimate organization that should be the umbrella under which all other forms of organization are given, which is ultimately the question of, which is how you arrive at the question of the party as this ultimate organizational umbrella. And I think this grammar, which, as I said, is just assumed without questioning most of the time, is problematic in a number of different ways. We could say perhaps that it derives from something we could call, we have the current expression when talking about historiography. We talk about the great man theory of history. We could say that the more general form of the great man theory of history is the main character theory of history. So the idea that there is in history, there is a main character, that this character has a certain form, and if it is a collective character, then it is an organization and it has a certain definite organizational form. And if you know what this form is and give that form to yourself, you too could be the main character. This is, there's a trillion billion tiny little communist parties have existed in history and exist today that basically believe in that. There is a main character in history, which is the masses organized through a party. And if you give yourself a certain definite organizational form, you too could be the main character. And you have this endearing spectacle of a trillion million tiny little sects who believe that they too could be the main character of history. And this, I think, is a harmful misunderstanding of how social change actually takes place, because social change doesn't happen through a main character, even if that main character is collective, as is the case of a party. One of the first things that I argue in the book is that social change happens through a combination of two different kinds of action that I describe in the book as, on the one hand, aggregate action, which is basically enormously high aggregate number of changes that are changes in individual attitudes, behaviors, sensibility, and so on and so forth, which doesn't need to be organized by anyone, and happens. The example that I give in the book, which I think is one of the best examples to think about that, is the sexual revolution. The way no one we refer to that as a revolution, and at the same time don't we don't see the need to identify a main character in it, because we understand that sexual revolution was a transformation that took an aggregate transformation that took place through an aggregate number of small behavioral changes. But on the other hand, you have collective action, properly speaking, which is those moments when usually precisely these changes in attitudes run up against obstacles that are organized, obstacles organized by the state, organized by capital, and so forth. And people see the need to come together in order to face those obstacles. And they may come together in permanent ways by starting organizations, or they may come together in more fleeting and less stable ways. But all of those would be examples of collective action. So social change always takes place as a combination of those two kinds of actions. Now, both kinds of actions, both the aggregate and the collective kind of action, from the moment we describe the situation in these terms, it becomes obvious that both of them suppose many centers. There are many centers of aggregate action, and there are many centers of collective action as well. There isn't a single character, or perhaps not even necessarily a main character. Again, if we think about the sexual revolution, we can talk about things like women's lib and gay lib, but those weren't movements, or those weren't organizations per se. They were movements that had several different organizations, and things that weren't organizations in the more in the stricter sense. And all of those things, all of those multiple different centers, were part of what women's lib or gay lib were. So ultimately, the idea here is that it's never a main character who wins. It's never a main character that produces social change. Social change is always produced by an organizational ecology. It's always an ecology that wins, which is not to say, to say an ecology is not, that's not just a different name for individuals acting together. Precisely, the idea of an ecology is organized in at several different scales. So you have individuals, but you also have organizations of different types. of different sizes that may be more permanent or less permanent, more formalized or less formalized, and so on and so forth. So to say, it's always an ecology that produces social changes, not to say that organizations aren't important. They are very important, but they depend on a broader mesh of relations that exceed those organizations and that they do not control. And therefore, organization must be said not only of singular organizations, but also of that broader mesh of relations in which organizations are enmeshed. Um, an ecology, of course, may be more or less centralized. So there may be, if we think of narrative form, it may tend more towards um, the bourgeois 19th century novel, in the sense that you have a main character or a couple of main characters, because the ecology is more centralized around a few centers, or it may be more decentralized. It may be more it may have more centers but smaller. Um, so it always exists between, as a combination of the centralized and the decentralized, which is what I call distributed, which is also I call the combination of aggregate and collective action, distributed action, and two, distributed action, which is this many-centered action, form of action, corresponds a topology, which is a distributed topology, which is a combination of centralized and decentralized, which may be more centralized. For example, if we look at the Russian Revolution, or more decentralized if we look at something like women's lib and gay lib, or the sexual revolution more broadly, but is always distributed, is always an ecology. And of course, it may be there are advantages and disadvantages to being more centralized and more decentralized, but the fact remains that it's always an ecology, it's always a distributed topology. So why is it harmful to hold on to that main character idea of history? I mean, first of all, it's wrong. I think it's an inaccurate or a much simplified understanding of how change happens. It's almost naive in a way. It tends to be very 19th century in terms of being very deterministic, being very subject centered, being very anthropocentric even. It misunderstands, I think, fundamentally what organization is and how organization works, among other things, because it doesn't understand that this mesh of relations that connects different organizations to one another, that connects people who don't belong to any organizations, to these organizations, or to one another, even if they don't belong to anything that we can recognize as a permanent, stable organization, and so forth. All of those things are also organization. So organization is not something that exists exclusively inside organizations. But even more importantly, and perhaps this is, we could say perhaps that this is the main problem. It obscures interdependencies. It obscures fundamentally the fact that it's always an ecology that produces change and not this or that main character. And if we think about the obviously the kinds of ecologies of political ecologies that I have in mind, which are those primarily concerned with fighting ecological collapse, with fighting commodification and capitalism, fighting the capitalist state, so on and so forth. You could say that one of the main things that these fights are about is precisely against the obscuring of interdependencies. So against the obscuring of ecological embeddedness, or again of humans, of human production, of the human system of production, the obscuring of the social embeddedness of the economy, the obscuring of the dependency of the dependence of the economy on reproductive labor that is just taken for granted and not accounted for. The obscuring that takes place when we talk about externalities in economics and so forth. And so it's, if one of the main things that the struggle is about is the obscuring of interdependencies, to have a theory of struggle that obscures interdependencies is a problem. And it's also, it produces a number of attitudinal problems. We could say it produces a bad it tends towards bad practice in the sense that this obscuring of interdependencies that comes with a main character theory of history fosters competition among the different groups that are trying to bring about change, but are trying to bring about change by being the main character within it. And while ecological relations do not exclude competition, I don't understand political ecologies as being, this perfect, spontaneous harmony in no way. But while ecological relations do not exclude competition, if competition is the default setting, it inhibits collaboration. And again, that is a problem because, if it if it takes a village to produce social change, to borrow from the African saying that it takes a village to raise a child, obviously, you need a lot more collaboration than competition. So competition being the default setting is a problem. Becomes a practical problem. So to think organization and to think politics ecologically means, first of all, to acknowledge that this is how organization and social change take place. It always takes place through an ecology acting together. And secondly, to act according to that idea, according to that recognition, according to the unobscuring and the acknowledgement of those interdependencies. So what follows from that practically? I would say the first thing that follows from that is what we could call a double fidelity. I like like many people coming of age politically and intellectually in the first decade of this century, I was I was quite influenced and struck by Badiou's idea of notion of fidelity and the fact that Alain Badiou turns this into one of the central categories of his political thought. But the kind of fidelity that I have in mind here is a double fidelity in the sense that you understand your belonging as being at the same time to a certain organization or to a certain strategy, to a certain strategic wager, and to a broader ecology, which means that in principle, you should never try to advance your organization or your strategy at the cost of the broader, at the expense of the broader ecology. You're always trying to advance both things at once and not assuming, as the main character theory of history leads people to assuming that the two interests always coincide. And oh, it's always in the interest of the broader ecology if my organization wins. No, Sometimes you have to accept not to win or to win less if that is going to if that means that the organization of ecology can win more or will be damaged less. Which means that another thing that follows from this idea, from thinking politics ecologically, is a certain notion of care, of attention and care for those interdependencies there are obscured a lot of the time, and therefore a care for this larger totality, a care for this whole in which your organization, your strategy, yourself exist, and accepting that not everything you do is going to be for the benefit of your organization, for the benefit of your strategy, but has also to be for the benefit of the whole, for the benefit of these broader relations. Attention to those interdependencies also means a better understanding of how change works, in the sense that it leads you to an acceptance that it takes all sorts, or that it takes a village to produce social change, i.e., an acceptance of the need for different roles and different subject positions at different times. Um, and in the book, I use a sports metaphor to talk about this. I say at some point, well, if we accept, as I think we must, that transforming the world is a collective sport, then like in most collective sports, one of the main things that you need all your players to have is positional awareness. You need players who are aware of the position of the other players and can play the role that is adequate to their position. You need neither a team that's controlled by a single person, nor one in which everyone is doing their own thing, but one in which everyone is looking at what other people are doing and adapting what they're doing to what others are doing, which also fosters, I think, a different practical attitude, in the sense that this lessens the egoic investment in oneself and on one's own role as the protagonist of social change, but also in one's role or one's subject position as being a radical or a moderate, or a hard-nosed realist, so on and so forth. Because in that case, if the primary thing is positional awareness rather than playing a given role in always the same way, then you accept that at some points you need to play the role of radical, and at other points you need to play the role of the hard-nosed realist or the moderate or whatever, depending on your reading of the situation. So you accept that you will need to play more than one role at different points, and you're not invested in your role as an identity. You're not doing it in order to play out an identity. You're doing it because this is what your reading of the situation indicates is what the situation calls for, which does not mean this positional awareness, this capacity to play different roles, to occupy different subject positions, doesn't mean abandoning strategy. On the contrary, I I think we need, one of the things that we need to bring back is strategy, precisely. But it means understanding that a strategy is never supposed. You don't develop a strategy as something that you intend to work for the totality, for the whole of the ecology, but to work within that totality. It's very interesting. The book came out in October in Italy, and it was very lucky because it came out precisely at the moment when there was that big explosion around the Palestinian question in Italy. So people people were like, "Oh, we have a movement ecology here. This is happening. We can see the things that the book is talking about." And it struck me that one of the sentences that the publishers in Italy pulled out from the book and were using in a lot of the publicity, I thought it was interesting because it's not, I don't know, it sounds a bit abstract. Maybe not the catchiest, but they seem to think it was catchy, and maybe people who saw it thought it too. But the sentence was, you don't organize a totality, you organize within a totality. And that is maybe the final implication that we could draw here from this idea of thinking and acting ecologically.
Well, there was a lot in this answer that I'm absolutely interested in. And I have to say, I really, really like this idea of organizational ecology. But I guess a question that immediately pops up is how forms of directionality do come about, not for this ecology, but through this ecology, as you just described. So I guess one argument people make with regard to, for example, the party form is that they think that this specific type of organization, the party form, is able to effectively provide this form of directionality, in this case mostly often through top-down forms of directionality, which you obviously critique, but nonetheless, the argument would then be that they are effective in providing this form of leadership, this form of cohesion and directionality. So then the question would be, if one thinks about organization through this ecological lens, how can cohesion and directionality come about differently?
Yeah, yeah. What do people, it's the magical attachment that people have to the idea of the party always strikes me as very interesting, because what do people ultimately mean when they say you need a party for that? Um, Obviously, they're drawing from a few historical examples, a certain historical sequence that begins with the Russian Revolution, in which parties played a key role. Then they played a key role in taking control of the state apparatus. If that was also, or the extent to which that was also social transformation, is a different question. So, that there is no, there is no question that it is a very useful organizational form when it comes to taking the state apparatus, or that it has been in the past, a very useful form in taking the state apparatus. Whether that, or the extent to which that is synonymous with social change, or with the kind of social change that we are committed to, and even those actors that were employing that form at that time were committed to, that is a different question. But obviously, that also happened in circumstances which were circumstances of the breakdown of the existing power. So the breakdown of existing state power, the situation of the first world, the defeat in the First World War, in the case of the Russian Revolution, or generally a weakening of military power, or an extreme weakening of legitimacy for the existing the governments that these parties were confronting, and then also certain circumstances in which there were organizations that had on the one hand a sufficiently cohesive leadership that could come up with decisions relatively quickly, and also in those cases a talented leadership which could come with good answers relatively quickly, and on the other hand a capacity to communicate those decisions to a large number of people. So when people say you need a party, they're saying you need that. The problem is that is not given in the idea of the party, or that those capacities will exist is not given in the form itself. If they were, every party would be able to do those things. So it's not simply a matter of the organizational form. It's not the organizational form per se that does that. It's the quality of the leadership, is the moment in which that, the quality of the answers that that leadership is able to provide at a given moment. It's the moment itself, the situation of acute breakdown of social reproduction and acute breakdown of state power, and the fact that people are looking for an alternative, is the fact that they managed already to develop a base. So when people say, when I say there is a magical attachment to the idea of the party, what I mean is there is an element of magical thinking in believing that if you give yourself that organizational form, the base that will follow you will be given. That is not given. And we have a trillion billion examples of tiny little parties who believe themselves to be the vanguard of the proletariat existing in the world today that have absolutely no purchase on any political situation that they find themselves in. So there is no necessary connection between giving yourself the organizational form of the party and having those things that people think they will have if they give themselves that organizational form. So what people are saying is, wouldn't it be great to have something that's capable of coming up with decisions quickly, who are also good decisions? They are good responses to the situation, responses that can command a lot of support from people, and then have the capacity to communicate those decisions to a large number of people? And the answer is yes, it would be great. Does that thing necessarily have to be a party? I don't think so. It could be a party, but it could be, we saw in the last decades, in the last decade in particular, we saw moments in which Facebook groups could fulfill that role. The Facebook group, We're All Khaled Said in Egypt, for example, that was very important in initiating the Arab Spring in Egypt, the Tahrir Square movement, and so forth. Or, tiny collectives like Democracia Real Ya and Juventud Sin Futuro in Spain, which were like the tiny collectives that initiated the 15M movement. Obviously, it's a different thing, having those organizing cores that have the capacity to initiate those things, but then they initiate movements that obviously they are not in capacity in a capacity to provide continued leadership for, and to have groups that have a capacity of continued leadership and who will continue to be able. What happens a lot of the time to groups like the ones I just mentioned, we're all Khaled Said or Juventud Sin Futuro or Democracia Real Ya, is, they can kickstart the protests, but after the protests are going, they no longer have the capacity to play that directional, or they have a much more limited capacity to play that directional role. And obviously there is a difference between being able to kickstart things and being able to kickstart and then provide continued leadership for those moments. But again, it's not a given that if you have a certain organizational form, you will be able to do it. It's ultimately not up to you to decide whether you will be able to be a leader or not. It's up to the situation. It's up to the ecology to decide that you will be or you will not be a leader. And it's very important if you have organizations that have a structure, that have a relatively large membership, that have the capacity to come up with decisions relatively quickly. It's very important that you have them within an ecology if they are capable of providing the appropriate answers at the appropriate time. But again, the form is no guarantee that they will be able to play that role. This is all to say that to talk about ecology is not to minimize the problem of where cohesion or where directionality emerges from. It's simply to pose the problem differently. It's to pose the problem not in terms of what is the organizational form that you need in order to be the main character in history, because there is no guarantee, there is no necessary passage from a certain organizational form to being capable of playing that role of providing cohesion or providing directionality. It's, you know, going from that way of posing the question to recognizing that, well, directionality will, in an ecology, it will emerge from different places at different points at different times. You have to have people, you have to have groups, you have to have organizing cores, organizations of any kind that understand this and prepare themselves to put themselves in that position of providing that leadership, of providing that directionality, without assuming that this will make them the leaders of the movement in any permanent capacity. They have what you need. Ultimately, what you need is groups, organizations, organizing cores, which is the broader category that I use to talk about all those things, that are ready to play that role, but are ready to play that role not by assuming that, well, come the time everyone needs to join our organization, but by thinking, well, come the time we must be ready to propose things to the ecology that will be useful in terms of providing a direction. And here there is, in the book, there is a corollary of saying that it's always an ecology that promotes social change is that strategy is always emergent. The strategy of an ecology is always something that emerges out of the action of different actors, of different organizing cores. But here there's an important I think that the book offers an important nuance to this to the whole conversation on emergent strategy, which you could say is a conversation that's been going on since the 1990s, at least. And this nuance is the following: there is a whole background narrative going on in the book about the relationship between political theory or political thought more broadly, you know, the political thought of activists and militants, people who aren't necessarily or who don't see themselves necessarily as doing theory, the relationship between political thought and science, and the fact that there is a certain lag in the reception of science, of scientific breakthroughs or transformations in the scientific mind, so to speak, and the reception of that into politics. So in the 19th century, in the 19th and early 20th century, despite Marxism being more or less contemporaneous with the scientific revolution that was thermodynamics, of which Marx was very aware because he was very well informed about the science of his time. And obviously, thermodynamics becomes so relevant because of the Industrial Revolution. But despite the fact that Marxism is more or less contemporaneous with um, the revolution in thermodynamics, the model of political action for Marxism seems to remain predominantly mechanical up until the mid 20th century, at least. So the idea is ultimately what you need is to build an organization that is bigger and stronger than the object that you're trying to move. So again, that is, that mechanical model of social change is connected to what I was calling the main character theory of history. You need to build something that is big enough to be the main character. This model goes into crisis from the mid 20th century onwards because it turns out that it does not lead necessarily to liberation. It leads to, or it led in several places, to a capacity to take the state apparatus. But then, you built something, you built a party that was like a parallel state apparatus in order to take control of the existing state apparatus. And once you take control of the state apparatus, then what you do is not necessarily liberation, is not necessarily human liberation in the terms that even they thought that they were promoting. And as a consequence, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and everything, the definitive crisis of that model, there is an attempt at updating political thought by drawing from scientific discourses on self-organization that were coming from complexity theory, from chaos theory, nonlinear dynamics, and so forth. And there is a problem in how that is done because obviously the problem in the background is, well, the political problem in the background is, well, we found out that building those large organizations turned out not to be the solution that it seemed at the start. They were very good for some things. They were good for taking the state apparatus, for example, but then they weren't that good when it came to promoting what their ultimate purpose was, which was human liberation or liberation more broadly. I mean, for them, it would be mostly human anyway. And so people are using complexity theory and these other, you have in the work of Ilya Prigogine in thermodynamics and so forth, all these different scientific discourses on self-organization, people were drawing from that to try and get away from organized collective action at scale. And therefore, immediately, the default move is to make change hinge on the individual, or to hinge on the very small scale, because the larger scale has become problematic. Trying to organize at a larger scale has become problematic, has become dangerous, something to be avoided. Then you take these discourses and you try to make them about, okay, how can individuals produce change? How can emergent change come out of the very tiny action of individuals, or at most, the very tiny action of very tiny groups? And the problem with that is that, at the time, one of the the sentences, one of the commonplaces that people would use all the time to justify that move uh, would be, well, if the fluttering of a butterfly's wings in Brazil can produce a hurricane in Texas, the title of the famous paper, like the founding paper of chaos theory by, God, completely blanked the name of the scientist now. Anyway, very famous paper, pretty much initiated the field of chaos theory. The problem with that move is that the paper itself answers no to the question. No, the fluttering of a butterfly's wings cannot, in Brazil, cannot cause a hurricane in Texas. What the paper says is, yes, very tiny changes can produce very, very large and unexpected effects if the system is close to a critical point, and those tiny changes are not so tiny that they can push the system over that critical point. But not every tiny thing can produce every large result. And thank God for that, because otherwise nothing would take hold ever. If it were that simple, if very tiny things could produce very large effects, if the tiniest things could produce very large effects at any given time, it would be impossible, for life couldn't have taken hold in this planet. So obviously there was a problem in that translation, which was ignoring those two conditionalities. First, you must be very close to a critical point. And two, you need sufficient strength to push the system over that critical point, which means that you cannot only act at the very individual, or at only the most local, the smallest scale. You need action at higher scales. You need a capacity to act at higher scales, and for that you are going to need collective action at scale. You are going to need collective organization at scale, in order to have sufficient strength to push the system over a critical point, or in order to determine an emergent strategy. So again, the problem, what this means for the question with which we started, which was the question of directionality, cohesion, and emergent strategy, is you won't get emergent strategy, or at least you won't get a good emergent strategy, unless it doesn't have to come from a single point. It doesn't have to come from the main character. It could come, inevitably, it will always come, even if there is a main character, even if an ecology is a more centralized ecology, what will come out of that the social change that will come out of that won't be simply what was in the head of the members of that organization, or what was in the head of the leaders of that organization. It will be something else. It will be the result of what they tried to do against the resistances that they found, against the other things that people were trying to do that intersected what they were trying to do in different ways. To go back to the Russian Revolution, what ultimately happened in the countryside had nothing to do with the Bolshevik strategy for the countryside. The Bolsheviks didn't control what was going on in the countryside. And then after the revolution was complete and they'd managed to take state power, they had to confront the fact that, okay, we got a situation that was very different from the situation that we thought we were going to get. And now we need to manage this situation somehow, which they tried to do throughout the 1920s until Stalin decides, no, we'll just impose. Now we have sufficient strength to just impose what our strategy was in the first place. So basically, you don't need to have a single point, and you don't need to have, and maybe, I just mentioned Stalin. Maybe that is an argument as to why it's probably not a good idea to concentrate all the leadership and all the strategic capacity in a single point. But you need centers, you need organizing cores, and these can take various different organizational forms, playing various different roles, doing different kinds of political action, political action that is through institutions, or political action that, is just direct action and so forth. But you need to have a sufficient number of sufficiently strong, sufficiently coherent, and sufficiently good organizing cores acting within an ecology in order to get a good emergent strategy. And this is why I said earlier that to talk about ecology is not to abandon strategy. On the contrary, we need to become better at thinking strategy. But we need to become better at thinking strategy starting from what we have, rather than starting from, there is this this joke about it's a biologist, an engineer, and an economist trying to move an elephant from one island to the next island. And the engineer looks at the elephant, he looks at the trees that are available in the island in which they are, and says, well, this tree can bend up to this degree, and therefore we could build a catapult, or we could build a crane that would be with those plants we could weave a rope that's strong enough that we could hoist the elephant on a crane, and then we could use this to twist the crane and move the elephant to the other island. And then the biologist says, well, we don't need any of that because this is an Indian elephant, and Indian elephants can swim. So all we need is to provide the incentive for the elephant, and the elephant can swim across to the other island. And then it's the turn of the economist, for the economist to give his idea of how to move the elephant. And the economist says, well, let's assume that the weight of the elephant is 0. And what people do when people say, well, we need a party in order to get strategy, what they're saying is, well, let's assume that we have lots of people who follow us. And then we can, if we get that, then we can move things. We can make things happen. We can produce strategy. And the problem with that is that you're assuming the most important bit, which is actually getting people to follow you. That's not a given. that is a consequence of the circumstances you're in, and your capacity to actually provide good answers in those circumstances, your capacity to actually come up with good strategic ideas. If you have those, and if you're good at presenting those at the right time, then you get people to follow you, regardless of what your organizational form is. So it's not the capacity. I don't think the capacity for strategy follows from having a certain organizational form. It's you actually need what the situation that we start from is, okay, we don't have any large mass organizations that already have a followership. So how do we create strategies? How do we create centers of collective action that produce this followership, which may take the form of mass membership in an organization, or may take all sorts of different forms? But the problem is, okay, how do we create those centers? And then once we have those centers, then we can think about, okay, what is the emergent strategy that these different centers are capable of producing within these circumstances, dealing with this particular political ecology and so forth.
I guess there are two main questions that I have following from this picture, because the first thing would be that I guess when people talk about the party form, it's not just this aspect of leadership itself, but it's also, and you kind of hinted towards that as well, but it's also a form of institutionalization, which is able to provide resources over time. So party can be a form that helps this form of directionality sustain itself over large periods of time. So it's not just this immediate leadership or just providing these ideas and answers to concrete questions, but it's also providing this institutionalized form of resources in order to sustain a certain directionality. So I guess this would then immediately bring up the question or the problem, more or less, and this is something you also more or less address in the book when it comes to reading organization through a pharmacological lens. This immediately brings up the question or the problem that typically, or historically speaking, these organizations that provide resources over time in order to sustain these movements or these types of directionality, they at some point indeed do think that because they provide these resources, they should be able to say where things should move ahead. So there is this problem, this danger that is coming about through the real necessity of needing institutionalized forms in order to not lose steam and be able to provide directionality over time, which then tends to bring about structures that want to become forms of more hierarchical leadership than an organizational ecology should allow for, so to speak. So that's, I guess, one aspect. And this then brings up the question that if we want to force these institutionalized forms into a position where they need to be aware of their organizational ecology and respect the interdependencies that they themselves build on, how can the ecology develop a form of power through which they can keep these centers in check, so to speak? And then finally, this, I guess, would be still connected to this broader question of identity or directionality or cohesion of the broader ecology itself, because I'm still curious how this identification with the broader ecology can be brought about. What is the carrier through which this attachment takes place? Because in the example that you gave, when you talked about this broader ecology as a form of team sport, you talked about the team, but there's not just the team, there's also a trainer usually. So it would be interesting to get an idea of who would be the trainer in this scenario without becoming a hierarchical leader, which is, I guess, often the case in trainership as well. And then what is the identity of the club? Because usually there are football clubs which provide a strong identity not only for the fans but also for the players. So there is a idea of collective identity around the whole project. So if we stick to this analogy, it would be interesting to learn about how this type of affective attachment comes about within a broader ecology of movements and organizations, so to speak.
Okay. Whoa, that was a lot. So
Sorry.
hang on. What what can you summarize that into a question?
Yes. I hope I can. I guess the first thing would be that it's not just about parties being able to provide answers in an effective way because of their form, but that they also provide forms of institutionalized provision for certain structures, so they are able to sustain themselves over time in a much more effective way than small organizations are able to, because of their size and because of their institutional strength, so to speak, and thereby they provide this also necessary form of resources that one can depend on, so to speak. So, and with that, historically speaking, they often think that they can and should have a form of leadership as well because they provide these resources. And how can this be brought about differently or thought of differently in that regard? And then the other aspect would be that if we have a broader ecology, then there would still need to be not a process, but some forms of emotional and affective attachment in place with regard to the goals of the broader ecology in order to provide this directionality from within the ecology itself. And how do you think about this form of, let's say, directionality through effective attachment and quote-unquote identities, maybe in plural, identities?
I mean, it's interesting, right? Because as I mentioned, I was recently in Italy. I did like this huge tour of Italy because of the Italian translation of Neither Vertical Nor Horizontal. And one thing that in Italy, you're constantly faced with this paradox, which is on the one hand, people complaining, nothing happens in Italy. Nothing has happened in Italy for ages. At the time when I was there in October, they were excited because of the pro-Palestine movement. And then when I was there again now in January, they like, oh yeah, no, it's back to normal. Nothing ever happens in Italy. And it's true that nothing has happened in at the national level in a while, apart from the pro-Palestine movement last year. And on the other hand, everywhere you go in Italy, there's this incredible local movement infrastructure that in a place like England, people can only dream of, or even the US, even in Brazil, maybe you don't have an infrastructure or a network of infrastructure, of movement infrastructure that is that capillarized as you have in Italy. And it's interesting because you have like different layers of different historical layers that are inscribed in those local infrastructure ecologies. One layer being you have the circoli arci, you have a bunch of things that are remnants of the movement infrastructure that was built through the Italian Communist Party. And so one thing that I told them, there was in Milan, I think someone asked me a question about this, and I said, well, it's great that this is like the 18th presentation of the book that I do in Italy, and it's the first time that someone realized that actually what I'm doing here is just selling you repackaged Italian theory. Because I would tell them, look, an ecology is not something foreign, alien that maybe will happen in the future. I mean, there is an ecology now. It's just one in which very little happens, as they complain. But they have this beautiful history of an ecology that was built by and through the Communist Party, which built it deliberately as an ecology that was, so you have cultural associations, you had like spaces which weren't spaces in which people were doing party stuff. They were doing, there were women's groups, there were, women would get together to, sew, or, men would get together to play chess. Kids would go in order to study literature. Things like that weren't directly party activities, but were creating, on the one hand, an ecological infrastructure, and on the other hand, a sense of identification. A sense of identification which was at the same time to the Italian Communist Party, and to, the world to come, to the workers' movement. We perhaps have lost that capacity today, because we have lost that capacity to project ourselves historically as a collective subject. But it was a capacity from which, or it was a capacity that allowed people to identify precisely with something that existed beyond themselves, beyond their families, beyond their existence, even because they knew that maybe I won't live to see this world to come. I won't see the day in which we will win, and was also beyond the party itself in international terms. So, I'm in solidarity with workers in other countries who are members of other parties, but I'm also in solidarity with them. The problem is, of course, once you came to doing politics at the national level, which is where most of politics is still done, then that broader ecological identification was channeled through one political channel, which was the Italian Communist Party. And that infrastructure was the condition, because I said, you see, when you go to Italy, you see this historical stratification, because you have like the circoli arci, which date back to the PCE, but then you have all the social centers, radios, cooperatives, etc., that date back to to autonomia in the 70s, which again was, and that's another way in which I've repackaged Italian theory. I say it in the book. One of the sources of the idea of ecology for me is the concept of area, the area of the movement as the Italian autonomia used the concept in the 70s. And again, there you had a brilliant work of building infrastructure, building, and even in that case, even stronger, because there you had, the organizations that were the properly, strictly speaking, political organizations, the organizations that tried to provide political leadership to that area, they were never that big. The little parties that existed within Autonomia, Lotta Continua, Potere Operaio, and so forth, they were never that big. They were never strong. So in that case, you had an identification to the movement that wasn't necessarily channeled through, or primarily channeled through, one main organization as being the representative, uh, or the ultimate political leadership of the movement. And that was, they don't like the people who've inherited these infrastructures from the old autonomous area. They perhaps aren't always too excited hearing this, but you wouldn't have had that rich an ecology that in from the late 60s up until the late 70s, when it was brutally repressed. You couldn't have that rich an ecology that was in tension and ultimately against the Italian Communist Party if you weren't building on the very rich ecology that the Italian Communist Party had built before. And at that moment, when this very rich ecology of autonomia builds on top of this very rich ecology of the Italian Communist Party, and then things come to a head, and the Italian Communist Party sides with the Christian Democrats in brutally repressing that movement. That illustrates very well the problem that you were talking about, which is the problem of, on the one hand, you do effectively need organizations, which may be parties and will be also other things, because, the PCE is gone, but the Circoli Arci still exist. So the Italian example is a great example of both ecology building and conscious, deliberate ecology building, and building of an ecology to a great extent as an ecology, as something that doesn't need to be entirely controlled by a single point. To a lesser extent with the PCE, to a greater, more conscious, more deliberate extent by autonomia. And then it's also a very good example of what happens when you have a single node within an ecology that is much more powerful than all the other nodes, which is, at one point when that ecology threatens to escape its control, then that node, which at some point played the role of cultivating that ecology, played the role of providing conditions of possibility for collective action, or the collective capacity to act, it becomes an obstacle, and it comes bearing down on it, and it crushes that ecology rather than risk losing control over it. It's also a very good example of the importance of organizations that can not only provide local temporal instances of leadership, but, as you say, provide continuity over time. Again, it's not a given that it's only parties that can do that. It wasn't in the case of Autonomia, for example. I would say arguably it wasn't only parties that were providing that for the much shorter time span in which Autonomia existed. But, nowadays, the PCE is gone. The Italian Communist Party is gone, but you still have the Circoliarci functioning locally and providing that continuity and that infrastructure. You still have the occupied social centers, cooperatives, radios, etc., that were created by the area of autonomia that are still there, providing continuity, even in the absence of a party. You could actually argue that today the problem is inverted and they provide continuity, but they don't provide leadership. They haven't been able to provide leadership in a long time. But all of this illustrates perhaps what is the central problem of the book, which is the fundamentally pharmacological, as I call it, nature of organization and power. Namely, by what I mean by pharmacological, obviously, I'm drawing this term from Jacques Derrida, who is basically just using the Greek word there, which is the same word for remedy and poison, to say that, this is what organization is, this is what power is. It's a condition of possibility. It's a condition of developing a collective capacity to act. But it can turn against you. It can become an obstacle. It can become a problem. And it becomes a problem, particularly from the moment in which it becomes too concentrated. It becomes so, on the one hand, you need, as I was saying before, to say ecology is not to say we don't need centers. It's exactly the opposite. We need centers. We need organizing cores that are capable of moving what's around them. But it's also saying we need more than one. We need it's good not to have all your eggs in one basket, because that minimizes that the risk of what was a condition of possibility, what was a remedy, turning into an obstacle, turning into poison. And as you identified very well, the book sees the answers to this problem as having to be given at two different levels. On the one hand, there is an ethical level, and there is, when I talk about in the book, and just now in the first answer, when I talk about the things that follow practically from thinking politics ecologically, this it has to do with an ethics, developing an ethics of ecological action that is an ethics that at once recognizes the importance of leadership, the importance of occupying that role, the importance of building organization, and recognizes the need for a certain reserve towards those things. We need to do them, but we need to be careful not to do them too much. And we need not to fall in love with power, as Foucault would say in his preface to Anti-Oedipus, saying that that this is a basic principle of he says Anti-Oedipus is a book of ethics, and the basic principle of the ethics of a non-fascistic life is to not fall in love with power, and especially not fall in love with our own power, perhaps. I mean, it's two problems. It's always two problems at once. Not to fall in love with the power that others have over us, but also if we do have power, when we do have power, not to fall in love with our own. So on the one hand, there is an ethical dimension, and on the other hand, there is a systemic dimension, which is, what are the ways through which a system and an ecology can protect itself from those risks. And well, essentially the answer is the less concentration, the better. But the problem again is that, well, you want organizing cores to be successful, and you want them to have the capacity to build things. The more they have that capacity, the more successful they are, the more they tend to acquire power, the more they tend to concentrate power. So you're always dealing with that. And to say to say the problem of organization and the problem of power are pharmacological problems is ultimately to say they don't have a solution. They don't have a solution, which means when a problem doesn't have a solution, what it means is not that you give up on it because you have no choice, but continue to deal with it. It means that you have to accept that you will never be done solving it. And it may come back to bite you at some point, and you can never really you can never really conjure, you can never really exercise that risk. And ultimately, when people think about the question of organization as a question, I was talking about the traditional, what I call the traditional grammar at the start. Organization is about singular, is something that is said of singular organizations. It's ultimately a problem of organizational form, the organizational form of those singular organizations. And it's ultimately the question of organization is ultimately the question, what is the ideal organizational form? Which you could say, what is the form that is ultimately boils down to what is the form that is the most effective and at the same time the most immune to those risks. And in the background of the idea that there is an ideal organizational form is the idea that there is a form that once found would solve these problems once and for all. And what I'm saying is this doesn't exist. Forget about it. You might give your organization the best possible form. It still won't be immune to those risks. And within an ecology requires precisely the kind of capacity. It requires its nodes to have precisely the kinds of capacity that make these nodes more prone to concentrating power. So, or the capacities that make these nodes concentrate more power. In other words, an ecology needs precisely that thing that is a threat to it. And this is why there is no solution to the problem. This is why the risks never go away. You're always just trying to guard yourself as best as you can against them, while also trying to harness these risks in the direction of changing the world.
But then there are indeed still certain mechanisms one could implement into organizations that are prone to becoming hierarchical in one way or another. So I think the question remains how one could think of the party, for example, as an organizational form that does not fall in love with power. Or I think it would be worthwhile to think about a institutional design that tries to inhibit parties from falling in love with power. And I immediately have to think of certain mechanisms like rotation, or in anthropological work, there's even social elements like institutionalizing that you make fun of people who want to assume a non-deserved leadership position, for example, So there are many different elements that one could try to implement into structures of organization that aim at preventing the negative aspect, the pharmacological aspect of power and organization to become dominant within these structures. So is this something that you engage with, these questions of institutional design, but also a certain design of social mechanisms that try to prevent these types of negative effects to take place?
I mean, one irony of the book is that for a book about organization, it actually deals very little with organizational form. And the reason for that is precisely that, I wanted to question the assumption that organization is solely about organizational form. Because I wanted to get away from what I'm calling the traditional grammar, maybe I got too far away from it. Yeah, there's also the question of getting away from the idea of an ideal form. So, trying to break with the habit that of thinking that, well, but still maybe we can find the rules that would make for a perfect organization, or an organization that would be immune from the risks of organization, from the risks of power, and so forth. But finally, there's also the fact that I was trying to draw attention to the fundamental difference between thinking of organization at the level of individual organizations and thinking organization at the level of an ecology, which is a difference that I describe in the book as the difference between bounded and unbounded orders. In a bounded order, you have more or less clearly defined boundaries. You have a more or less clearly defined sense of who belongs, and you have a more or less and therefore you have the conditions for deliberation on form, procedures, and so forth. In an ecology, you don't have any of that. And what I really wanted to develop was this point. Well, how does decision happen then? How does organization happen in an unbounded order? And which is why I end up talking about organizational form, I guess, surprisingly little for a book on organization. Also, perhaps because I don't maybe I don't have anything too original to say about that. Like the examples of mechanisms that you raised, the rotation of functions. We could also add fixed mandates, permanent recallability, a limitation to the amount of times people can, or the amount of time people can serve a certain function, the distribution of authority and tasks. Um, yeah, I mean, all of those things, because the focus of debates on organization has always been on organizational form. I think those things have already been thought about extensively, and I don't know that I have much to add to that. I think you mentioned drawing from anthropology, and I think that is a great idea as well, because so-called primitive societies actually have incredibly sophisticated ways of dealing with the risk of concentration of power. You mentioned the thing about making fun of people who want to become leaders, which weirdly enough is a tradition that lives on in the U.S. I mean, the office with the office
Mm.
of the
Ah.
U.S. president, you have the what is it? The White House Correspondents' Dinner, every year in which you have someone come and make fun of the president. So clearly, making fun of making fun of the leader alone is not the solution to the problem. But you also have, among lots of indigenous groups, you have the tradition of distributing once a person dies, distributing their their goods or burning them so as to prevent accumulation from one generation to the next. And yeah, I guess there is a treasure trove of ideas that we can draw, maybe much more interesting and original than anything that I might have to say about the topic, that we could draw from anthropological, from ethnographic accounts. Ultimately, however, there's still all of these things are only ways of managing this fundamental problem that's fundamentally unmanageable, which is the problem of power, the problem of and one of the things one of the things that there's lots of different fancy ways in which I describe the book from time to time. So I say it's the marriage of Leninism and cybernetics, and another fancy tagline that I've invented for it is that it's an attempt to give post-structuralism the theory of organization that it lacked. And it's interesting because it always struck me that people when people used or most of the time when people used post-structuralism, when people used particularly Foucault and Deleuze and Guattari to think about politics, they would start from these very sophisticated analyses of power to arrive at very one-dimensional theories of organization and politics, and a distinction between good power and bad power. So there's good power on one side, bad power on the other side. We need good power and not bad power, which is a distinction that gets turned into the distinction between power over and power to, and that distinction then gets confused with a different distinction, which is the distinction between potentia and potestas, the capacity to act, and the let's say organized capacity to act, or the congealed, the fixed capacity to act that is potestas. And I think I could have actually been more incisive and clearer in the book about this, but I think those distinctions, the way in which those distinctions are usually employed, tend to get it completely wrong, because ultimately there is no power to that's not also a power over. If power to is the capacity to do things in a world of things, some of which things are also people, other people, the power to do things is power that is exercised over other things, and therefore also other people. So, there isn't good power, bad power. The power to do things is also always the power to do things to others. And when we come to the potentia potestas opposition, potestas is not simply power turned bad. It is, or power turned evil. It means power, or the capacity to do things, concentrated, congealed, given a fixed apparatus that by shoring up that capacity renders that capacity automatic. So, you build an army, for example, and once you build an army, then you have a way of ensuring, or you build a police, and once you have a police, Well, the king, before the king has a police, he is obeyed out of tradition, or he is obeyed because he is a good leader. From the moment he has a police, he has an instrument that allows him to ensure that even if people don't want to obey him, people don't think he is a good leader anymore, they still will obey him. So the issue lies not in, it's not a moral distinction between good power and bad power, but the issue lies in this automatization of power. This is what creates the danger. From the moment a position of power becomes fixed, because it now has the apparatus to command obedience from people, from the moment that an apparatus to command obedience exists, then the risk of capture of that power, that power that previously had to be exercised in the interest of all, because that was the only way to command obedience. Now that there is an apparatus for commanding obedience from people, the risk of that power being captured by private interests or by the particular interests of a certain group becomes much greater. That's where the problem lies. And therefore, this also means, ultimately, when we're talking about organizational form, when we're talking about the sort of problem that you just raised, and also when we're talking about how organization works in an unbounded order in which those decisions cannot be made, there is no place from which, or there is no collectivity with which could make those decisions. Ultimately, we're always talking about the so-called problem of the institutionalization of freedom. You want to protect freedom, and in order to protect freedom, you set up institutions that will protect that freedom. The problem is, once you set up institutions, those institutions can become an obstacle to freedom. And ultimately, I think what thinking about those questions at the level of unbounded orders, at the level of an ecology, rather than at the level of individual organizations, what thinking of the problem at that level allows us to realize is that the perfect institutionalization of freedom is ultimately not trying to institutionalize it too much. You need to leave some room open for novelty, for difference, for changes in the ways of doing things. And you don't want to run the risk that once those new things, those new ways of doing things, those novelties of whatever kind, new needs, desires, so on, appear, that the institutions that you created to secure freedom in the past won't be used to repress those new freedoms or those new desires, demands, and so forth. Which is, again, trying to explain the paradox with which we started. Again, perhaps why the reason why I didn't focus so much on questions of organizational form. But you asked, are you interested in those questions? Yes, and people actually, they want to discuss those things with me all the time, because obviously, people want to discuss their organization. So they want to discuss, when they approach me, asking me for suggestions, opinions on what they're doing, that's usually what they want to talk about. So it's definitely something I need to talk about more.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not only the question of looking at the organization and how one might develop certain mechanisms in order to prevent a form of hierarchical domination or stuff like that, but it's also very much about the question of how an organization should think about itself and organize itself in order to be a sensible element within this broader ecology. So this
Yeah.
relation would need to be negotiated as well, and there would need to be an understanding within the organization of their positionality and their responsibility within this broader ecology. And maybe let me phrase it a little bit different in order to maybe come to a point where we can draw a bit of a picture of how this ecology itself can act, in lack of a better word, because I'm quite interested in a revived debate around questions of democratic planning, and I do think that one needs to think about these questions through an ecological perspective, but this obviously raises many questions, some of which we talked about already. But maybe if I pose the question through this lens, we can get to different answers. I'm not sure, because I would be interested if one would state that any form of desirable societal transformation, social ecological transformation, is dependent on forms of democratic planning in one way or another, which I'm quite convinced of, then immediately we would need to ask how forms of distributed democratic planning can take place within these ecologies of organization. And this, of course, brings up many of the elements that we already talked about, but maybe if I just pose it like that, how do you think about this nexus of democratic planning in, with, and through ecologies of organization?
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely a question that has interested me more and more since I wrote the book, and one in which I intend to do more work. And I can tell from the list of interviewees in the podcast, I can tell that it's a big interest of yours, because you've interviewed people like Cédric Durand and Aaron Benav and Jasper Burns, and who else? Evgeny Morozov, who are all working on similar questions. And it's something that I find their work very, their reflections on these questions very exciting, and it's definitely an area in which I want to work more. I don't know that I have so much to say about it right now. I mean, the first thing is, the first thing I would say is I think there are two camps nowadays in conversations about climate change and the Anthropocene. There's on the one hand people who I would say, recognize climate change as a problem that was produced by certain modes of coordination, as a problem of coordination that was produced by certain modes of coordination. Fundamentally, the two modes of coordination, the two planetary modes of coordination that exist today, which are the capitalist market and the system of nation states. And because climate change is a problem of coordination that was created by these two modes, or these two spaces of coordination, the reaction of these people is perhaps not entirely consciously, but is to say, yes, climate change is a problem of coordination. It was produced by these modes of coordination, ergo, coordination is bad. And what we need is actually, you know, a radical relocalization that would preempt any questions of coordination, because, people would be living and doing things very locally, and very locally they would be able to decide on what they're doing. But coordination is bad. You shouldn't try it to coordination is what got us here in the first place. It was uh, developing the capacity of coordination at a planetary scale, which was developed through the expansion of the capitalist market and through the expansion of the nation state system. This is what got us in this mess. So, let's just not coordinate. And I think that to respond to a problem of coordination with what we need is no coordination whatsoever strikes me as an incredibly risky move, to say the least. And it also, I think it leaves us with a very unclear perspective of how we would even move from the kinds of coordination we have now, and the kinds of translocal infrastructure that we have, how we would move from what we have now, how it would transition to this world in which coordination would no longer, things would be so localized that coordination would be no longer necessary. I remember a conversation that I had with a very good friend with whom I disagree on these questions, to whom I said, look, individual decisions, completely delocalized, non-coordinated individual decisions can't destroy fossil capitalism. People doing yoga, drinking tea, and consuming locally in and of itself is not going to give us the transition that we need, particularly not in the time frame in which we need it. And he was like, well, but a world in which everyone is drinking tea, doing yoga, and consuming locally is a world is if everyone did that, then it could destroy capitalism. And I was like, no, what you're describing is a world in which we would have had defeated capitalism. But that is a different thing. The problem is how we get there. And we can't get there by doing the things that look like the world we would get once we got there. We need to do other things. We need coordination for that problem. We need coordination in order to untangle and dismantle the modes of coordination that exist now and which caused the problem in the first place. So I'm on the opposite camp in this discussion, which is essentially the camp that says climate change is a problem of coordination, maybe one we're not capable of solving. I think this is highly likely, particularly not in the time frame that we have. But climate change is a problem of coordination, and the answer to that is not less coordination, but more coordination. But obviously also different coordination. And the cognitive translation of that problem is when people say it was attempts at modeling the global. It was attempts at modeling the totality that got us into this mess. So what we should do is stop thinking about the totality, stop thinking about the global, and focus only on the local. And my response to that is, again, we to a problem of coordination, we respond not with less coordination, but with more coordination and better. To a problem of bad modelings of the global, we respond not with less attempts at global modeling, but with more, except they are better, they're more diverse, they're more self-reflexive, they're more they're done from different perspectives. They're done at different scales of granularity and so forth. So you multiply instead of eliminating modeling, you actually need to multiply it. And once you multiply modeling, then you multiply, then you can develop models of models, and so on and so forth. And it's the same thing, I would say, with coordination, because coordination or democratic planning is essentially modeling put to practice. Is the Yeah, it's the practical equivalent of modeling. So you need, instead of less of that, you need more of that, and you need that organized at different scales, and then different scales coordinated in different ways, and so forth.
I think, I mean, when I read your book and when I hear you talk, there are a lot of overlaps between the way in which the current planning debate speaks about how democratic planning can come about, and the way that you talk about forms of ecological organization, namely these overcoming of dichotomies between central and decentral. That would be an important example. And also the form of, let's say, distributed leadership, which is attached to this overcoming of this dichotomy, because within the planning debate, at least, there is an emphasis that, for example, for purposes of harnessing local knowledges, there is a need for a certain form of autonomy, or let's say semi-autonomy, of the producing nodes that that have a specific tacit knowledge of the production processes that needs to be involved into the production process itself, but also within the broader planning processes as such. So there is a really interesting overlap, I think, between the ideas that you proposed within the book and this lens of ecological forms of organization and the planning debate as it stands right now. I think for me, still, the question remains how a certain form of, let's say, meta-organization is being brought about through these ecologies, because at least within the planning debate, there is, and you also emphasized this, there is still a need for a certain form of central element, which is uniquely able to provide specific knowledges, specific perspectives, and also uniquely able to provide certain forms of action, let's say. And both when looking at the planning debate as well as looking at your work, I think for me, it still remains an open question as to how a certain form of coherence of the overall directionality is being brought about. This is something we talked about early on in our conversation. And I think still, after discussing all these different elements of it, it still remains to be an open question, for me at least, because I do understand that you argue for a multiplicity of centers. You argue for a certain awareness of this pharmacological aspect of organization, that every organization should be aware of the dangers inherent in organization itself. And I totally agree with these elements, but this does not yet answer the positive question, or the positive element of harnessing a power in order to provide forms of meta-organization, and how the different elements of a organizational ecology relate to this element of meta-organization itself. I think this would be something I'm still quite interested in.
I think none of us who have been thinking about these questions have the answer to that, really. I think we're all trying to grapple with, we're laying the railway now, I think, in the sense that, we're building the stepping stones that might get us to an answer to this question. But I don't think anyone is there yet because yeah, it's a big modeling challenge, and you know, at a scale that we have at which we have an incredibly limited capacity to model, both in terms of, you know, the amount of data that we would need to have to provide a model that is of any use, but also in practical terms of implementing things and seeing if they work and so forth. I would say maybe one last thing to connect back to what we were saying earlier about the institutionalization of freedom is also the question of the the tension between thinking about planning structures as something building towards ever higher levels of organization. So building towards a meta organization that brings all these different planning structures under itself. And so ultimately, democratic planning as something tending towards a bounded order. And then the problem of unbounded order. What is the ecology? You know, because ultimately, it seems when we start thinking about democratic planning at a planetary scale, it is some kind of world government that are we are tending towards. Um, hopefully, the far right don't pick up on this, and and yeah, there is a question of whether there can be a bounded order at that scale, or well, even if there is a bounded order at that scale, it will still have an ecology, whatever is not bound by that bounded order or bound to that bounded order will be its ecology. And then what is the relationship between that bound? There's let's say there's a the transition problem while you're working towards a meta organization, which is, well, you have different bounded orders which are coexisting, and ideally they would be converging towards a single bounded order. But for the moment, they are elements in an unbounded order. They are parts of each other's ecologies. How do they relate to one another? And then there is, if we can imagine that convergence happening at ever higher levels of coordination, then there is, let's say, the final boss coordination question, which is, well, assuming this bounded order has been built, what is the relationship between this bounded order and whatever is not inside this bounded order? I mean, I say this here for purely speculative purposes because definitely don't pretend to have any answer to this question right
Yes,
now.
well, understandably so. Before I ask the last question that I ask all of my guests, I have to bring up the question of transformation. So, what does all of this, this ecological perspective on questions of organization, what does this mean for the immediate and urgent task of transforming our societies now? So basically, the old question of what to do, given that we now think about questions of organization through a ecological perspective.
Yeah. Um, I mean, it's always easier to start answering that question from what's farther away from us than what's closer. And this is the problem. I think I say this in the book at some point, that for a long time we have heard that we have a crisis of imagination, and the problem, we don't know, we can't act because we don't know what we're acting towards and what we're trying to build. And actually, in the last, I think, this might have been true of 20, 30 years ago, but in the last, particularly in the last decade, you had like a huge proliferation of something we could describe as utopian thinking, in the sense that it's trying precisely to some of the people we've just mentioned, that you've interviewed in the podcast before, who are trying to come up with visions of what it would look like to what yeah, a different world, a world that would have solved the problems that we're faced with now would look like, even if it's just drinking tea and doing
Mhm.
yoga. So, in that sense, if we talk about I mean, I don't claim to see that far into the future, although I'm very stimulated by the people who are trying to propose those visions. But I would say the horizon of our time is transition. The horizon of our time is ecological transition. And to those of us, so, well, the horizon, the most immediate horizon of our time is a transition away from fossil fuels. But I don't believe that transition can be done without larger changes coming about. And anyway, it would be a massive wasted opportunity if transition became only green transition, only transition away from fossil fuels. So the horizon is a broader ecological transition. And for those of us who, like me, believe that this is impossible within capitalism, then it's also the end of capitalism. That is a condition for the kind of transition that we effectively need. So the defining problem of our time is the problem of transition. And as I argue in the book, I think it takes precedence over the problem of revolution today. The question is no longer the articulation between the two terms is no longer that existed in the Marxist tradition, where transition was understood as a period of mediation between the existing social formation and the social formation of the future that came about after a revolutionary break, but rather, so the question is no longer what kind of transition after revolution, but what kind of revolution for transition, or what what role revolutionary breaks, or what role ruptural politics, to take Eric Olin Wright's term, plays within this historical horizon of transition, which is a horizon that's not even, we either we get that horizon relatively fast, or we don't get much of a horizon anymore. And the problem of the last decade is that the movements of the beginning of the decade, the cycle of protests that neither vertical nor horizontal is largely about, or is most immediately concerned with, which is that of the so-called movement of the squares, Occupy, the Arab Spring, 15M, so on. Those movements were at once a show of strength and a show of weakness, in the sense that, they showed that there was the ferment. There was an anti-systemic ferment in the air that had been produced by, all the fallout, the economic and political fallout from the 2008 crisis, and Yeah, it's, for a moment, it shook. Those movements shook those in power, but then those in power made the calculation that maybe they could wait them out and they would fizzle out, and they did, which is one of the reasons why I end up writing the book is precisely, okay, how do we not
Yeah.
do that again? We have the technological means now that allow us to have mass movements without mass organizations, to have movements that scale up very fast to a very large size, but then they seem to lack the staying power to turn into a long-term challenge to capital and the state. So how do we get that? Hence the need to return to the problem of organization. But the my impression is that the lesson that global elites drew from that was, on the one hand, that there was a risk, there was a danger there for them, but on the other hand, that this risk was weak. And so they respond to the danger, but their response to the danger is not to change direction in any way, but on the contrary, to accelerate, to step on the gas. So we started moving faster in the direction of the concentration of wealth, in the direction of accelerating climate collapse, and so on and so forth, instead of correcting course. And obviously, this tendency becomes even stronger once that anti-systemic ferment is appropriated by the far right, because it's still there, but then global elites find a political force which can harness that sentiment in the direction of their interests, and that is precisely used to accelerate in the opposite direction, basically. So my feeling today is that we're farther from we were 10 years ago in terms of getting to that horizon, the horizon that the horizon of the time in which we live, which is, I believe, the horizon of transition, which, 10 years ago, we were thinking about the Green New Deal. And, can the Green New Deal become something that could induce the kind of transformation that we need? And I think, the conversation was, I think there was a very unfortunate, some people created a very unfortunate, still do, in fact, create a very unfortunate contradiction between Green New Deal and degrowth. I think, ultimately the horizon of transition is the horizon of a degrown world. But because in order to get there, there are things that still need to be developed, to be grown, quote unquote. We need something like state induction of those processes, which is precisely what you would get with something like the Green New Deal. But that was what we were talking about 10 years, and now even that seems off the table, and instead we're getting like accelerating tech insanity and like a new speculative bubble that promises, it's literally the speculative bubble to end all speculative bubbles, because it's literally saying, give us all your money and we'll solve climate change, as well as curing cancer, bringing back the Beatles and whatever else AI is promising to do this this week. And yeah, so we're accelerating in the direction of something that's incredibly resource consuming and is not even clear, apart from, there being no guarantee that it can do any of the things that they promise us that it can do, or bring any of the benefits to humankind and the planet that they promise us that it could do. It's not even clear that it makes money, or it's not even clear that it makes money apart from the building of data centers. So we're building data centers in order to discover what building data centers can do. The only thing that we know for sure is they can destroy the planet. And we've already done enough of that, and we should be doing the exact opposite at this point. So sadly, these are the conditions in which we are, which means that, we're basically accelerating in the direction of a planet in which ever less people fit, and an economy that serves ever less people, which means a rising crisis of social reproduction on all levels. And this is where the political potential is nowadays. I think it's not so much in the sphere of production, but in the sphere or the way you can find a base for a radical, the means through which you can get, obviously the sphere of production is still important, even if decreasingly so, to the extent that it might have some direct impact on capital. But the place where you can find the base, or the point from which you could start building a base for a radical project of transformation, of transition, and so on today, I think, is in the growing bottlenecks of social reproduction. So I think that's where we should be looking at, and it's from those points that we should be trying to develop our strategies, and organizations and plans.
Rodrigo, there's a last question that I ask all of my guests, and it is, if you think about the future, what makes you joyful?
I love that question because it's not about hope. Usually when people talk about the future, they talk about, I guess the more normal question would be, what makes you hopeful about the future? And I like it that, you know, there seems to be an implication here that joy can exist in the absence of hope, even. And I think when I think about the future, what makes me joyful, I, like several people, I think, have gone through moments in my life when I thought, oh God, I've had enough. This is it. And ultimately, the reason why we don't do it, the the reason why we don't turn the thought of, I've had enough into action, is because I think, then you think, yeah, but think about all the nice things that could happen. And those nice things aren't necessarily, winning a Nobel Prize or winning an Oscar, or, anything too far out and too far-fetched and fantastic. It's maybe just, the joy of like a ray of sunlight hitting your face at just the right time, or the joy of walking around and seeing the light on leaves and hearing birds singing, or a really great evening with people you love and things like that. And it's the prospect of those joys that keep you going more than anything else. And I think ultimately the fight for that, the struggle has always been about this, about, a world in which those moments are possible and they are available to all, in large quantities. And even more so, ever more so now, because, if we're looking at a situation in which we're accelerating towards an economy in which less and less people fit, a world in which less and less people fit, we're talking about precisely the progressive disappearance of those moments. So it's ultimately the possibility of those moments that make us joyful, that we're fighting for.
Wonderful. Rodrigo, thanks so much for being part of Future Histories.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was our show for today. Thanks a lot for listening. If you want to support Future Histories, you can do so on Patreon. For this, visit patreon.com/futurehistories, or you can simply tell a friend that you liked the show and that he, she, or they might like it as well. Thanks a lot, and hear you in 2 weeks.